Alright, here in this video we're really going to walk through our next little chunk of our first unit. And we always want to start with our learning targets, so these should always be in the first part of your notebook. So today we're going to go through the parts of a fraction, and then we're going to really start with this beginning. We're going to look at adding and subtracting fractions. In the next video is where we're going to go through multiplying and dividing, so today we're just going to add and subtract. And I'm really today going to just walk you through the notebook, so you are going to need to pause several times and just make sure that your notebook is looking kind of like this. So today is one of those days where you do need to have some color. So either some colored pens or some markers or some of both is really what I have in my notes. So we're really starting to talk about fractions. And I know that everybody kind of freaks out when we start with fractions, but we do need to know what they are and how to use them and really what to do with them. Okay, so here we're going to go. And your notebook should look just like mine. So go ahead and take these as we're going through. And remember, anytime you need to pause to catch up, do that. Okay, so we've been looking at whole numbers, both positives and negatives. So now what if it's not a whole number? That's what we're dealing with when we're dealing with a fraction. So a fraction is written as a part out of a whole. Okay, so the whole number becomes our denominator, and the numerator is the part of the pieces, how many of them we have. So now we're going to show a couple of examples of that. So we're looking at the parts of a fraction. Remember, and this is one of your main learning targets. Okay, so again, you'll see I'm going to keep my colors pretty consistent. So my numerator is going to be red, and that's how many pieces we actually have. Okay, our denominator, that bottom number, is how many pieces the whole is cut into. So we always kind of want to start with what is the size of the pieces we're dealing with, and then how many of them do we have. So then let's take a look at this. One thing with our denominators, we want to remember they have to be equal parts. I can't just cut this willy-nilly. It has to be in equal parts. So in this example, I see I've taken one whole box and I've cut it into 8 pieces, so that becomes my denominator, and 3 of them are shaded, so that's my numerator. Okay, so this fraction that would represent here is 3 divided by 8, or 3/8. Okay, so now you're going to need this foldable, this little flippy book. So take a second and go ahead and cut this out, and you'll see that you're going to cut along the whole square, the big one, and then you're going to cut along the like dashed lines to make some flaps. Then if you want to, go ahead and glue it into your notebook. Then we're going to start filling out the pieces. Okay, so first we're going to look at equivalent fractions. Let's see if I can make this kind of work for us. That's kind of how it fits on my table. This will work. Okay, so equivalent fractions. So underneath here, you are going to still need some colors. Okay, so an equivalent fraction is, we deal with these a lot. So these two right here are my examples of equivalent fractions. So this first one I see is cut into 3 chunks. So that's my denominator, and 2 of them are shaded. So that's the numerator. So here I have 2/3. But if we look down at this example, I see I'm cut into 6 equal parts, and 4 of them are shaded. We can see the same exact amount is shaded. So these two are in our equivalent fractions. Okay, so remember that the bottom tells me how many equal parts, and the top is how many are shaded. These two are the same. They're equivalent fractions. Okay, so here we can look at another little example, right? So if I start with that 2/3, that top one that we had, if I multiply both the numerator and the denominator by the same number, so here I multiplied it by 2, I end up with 4/6, which is an equivalent fraction. So if I multiply it again, I get 8/12, equivalent fractions. I can multiply it by whatever I want, as long as I multiply the numerator and the denominator by the same thing. I can also divide the numerator and the denominator by the same thing. So if you're given 40/60 or 40/60ths, if I divide that by 10, both the numerator and the denominator, I would end up with 4/6, and those are equivalent fractions. Okay, so now let's look at our simplest form. So simplest form is really kind of a part of our equivalent fraction. So our example here is to convert 6/8 to simplest form. So the first question is we have to ask is, what number can divide into both the numerator and the denominator the same, like evenly? Okay, so here I notice that both can be divided by 2 because they're both even numbers. So I want to go ahead and do that. So I've got 6/8 divided by 2, both of them, that have to be the same thing in the numerator and the denominator, and I get 3/4. So then I can ask myself that question again. Can 3/4 be divided by the same thing? And they're both, they can't be divided by the same thing, because the only thing that goes into 3 is 3 and 1, and we don't really care about 1s. And then 4 is 2, and those are not the same thing. So this is simplest form. And we're going to work really hard to always get down to simplest form. Okay, let's look at comparing fractions. Okay, so we're going to compare 5/6 and 3/4 and see which one is bigger. The first thing we really want to do is we want to get the fractions to have the same denominator, because when we're looking at them just like this, we can't actually compare them all that well. We can't see which one is bigger. So the first step we do is we list the multiples of the denominators. So I started here with 6, so it's 6, 12, 18, 24. My multiples of 4 would be 4, 8, 12, 16, and then I noticed that they both share a multiple of 12, so that's going to be where I'm going to live. So I convert my fractions, so 5/6, so to get from 6 to 12 I have to multiply by 2, so that's what I also have to do in the numerator. I have to multiply 5 times 2, which gives me 10. My second fraction was 3/4, and I know to get from 4 to 12 I multiply by 3, so I have to do that in the numerator as well, so I end up with 10/12 and 9/12. So now that my denominator is the same, I can compare the numerators, and 10 is greater than 9. So this first fraction, this 5/6, is greater than 3/4. Okay, so when we're comparing, we always want to get our denominators the same first, because then we can compare really easily the numerator. Okay, let's look at our visual model. Okay, and we've seen some of these before, but we want to always kind of go back to it. Okay, so I have just a box here, and it's broken into 8 equal parts, so that becomes the denominator, and the number in the numerator is how many are shaded. I generally like to look at rectangles and fractions just because circles are, for me, much more difficult to divide evenly. But if you like circles, go with circles. So let's look here at a mixed number. So a mixed number is a whole number and a fraction together. So our example here is 3 and 1/2. Okay, so this 3 tells us I have 3 whole ones, and I have 1/2 of another one. So here's kind of a visual model, and here I used circles. So I see I've got 1, 2, 3 whole ones. This fraction I see is cut into 2 pieces, which is my denominator, and one of them is shaded. Okay, this can also be written, and we're going to look at this in just a second, as 7/2, as 7 seconds, because each one of these is divided into 2 pieces, and totally 7 of them are shaded. So on our next page, we're going to look at going back and forth between mixed numbers and improper fractions. Okay, so then our last little chunk right here is fractions on a number line. So we can also see fractions on a number line. So here you see I've got our number line, but I go from 0 to 1. The number line can also be divided into 4 equal parts, which is our denominator, and one of them is shaded, so that will become my numerator. Okay, so here's just some basics of fractions. So now let's go ahead and flip the page, and here's where we're really going to look at converting improper fractions and mixed numbers. Okay, so here's where you're just going to be taking some notes. So the first thing is to go from a mixed number, which we talked about has a whole number and a fraction, to an improper fraction, and an improper fraction is where the numerator is larger. I kind of look at this. So here's my mixed number, is 3 and 1/4. So I drew myself a little picture over here. So there's 3 whole ones shaded, and 1/4 of another one. Okay, so I could also say that since each one is divided into fourths, that still stays to be my denominator, and then I can count. So I've got 3, 6, 9, 10 of them together. Okay, and my math was wrong there, so 4, 8, 12, 13. That makes more sense. So I have 13/4 total. So here's how you do it with just the numbers, okay? So here's kind of what we're looking at. So I take my denominator and multiply it times my whole number, and then I add that other little piece, okay? So my denominator is always going to stay the same. So if I started with fourths up here, I'm going to continue with fourths right here. So here's our steps written out kind of nicely. So first I multiply the denominator and the whole number, then I add the numerator back in and get 13/4. So now let's look at going the other direction. We're going to go from an improper fraction to a mixed number. So here's our example is 7/2. So I draw myself some boxes, and they're cut into 2 equal pieces. and 7 of them are colored. So here I see I have 1, 2, 3 total, 3 wholes and 1/2. So the way I can do this is I divide how many times does the denominator go into the numerator. So I know 2 goes into 7 3 times. That becomes my whole number. And then the pieces that I have left over becomes my new numerator. Again, my denominator stays the same because my pieces are not changed. They're still the same size. Okay, so there's some converting for us, and this will come in really handy. Most of the time we're going to be looking here at improper fractions, so it's really important to know how to get there. Okay, so the next thing we're going to look at is adding and subtracting fractions. So this is the piece of paper that you're going to need. So what you're going to do is cut around the big box, and then we're going to cut along each strip, but leaving this line here, so this is where you're going to glue. So what's going to happen here is I'm going to walk us through adding these two, then you are going to work to subtract these two, and this is kind of what I'm going to check for your notes. So the first step is we organize them, and for me, we always I like to go across. Sometimes you're given word problems, so this step comes really into play when you're organizing those fractions. Then we want to find the common denominator. So just like we did before, we found the multiples of each denominator. So my multiples of 4 are 4, 8, 12, 16. And my multiples of 6 go 6, 12, 18. Then I see I have a common denominator there, which is going to be 12. So like we looked at before, we're going to make our equivalent fractions. And in order to do that, I'm going to look at my 3/4 first. And I know to get from 4 to 12, I multiply by 3. So I also have to do that in the numerator. Okay. Then at my 5/6, I know to get from 6 to 12, I multiply by 2. So 2 over 2, and I end up with 10/12. Okay? And the reason we can multiply these fractions like this, because I'm just multiplying by 1. Because remember, anything divided by itself is 1, and I can always multiply by 1 because nothing actually happens. So now is when I actually add or subtract. So I'm going to keep my denominators the same when I'm adding or subtracting, because the pieces don't change size at all, and then I add my numerators here. So I will end up with 19/12. Okay, and I just explained why my denominator stays the same. Make sure you understand why that's the case. The pieces did not change size at all. So then my last step would be simplify. So then the question I ask is there a number that goes into the numerator and the denominator evenly? So for this case, there isn't, so it is fully simplified. Okay, so now I want you to actually go through and follow these steps, and hopefully you saved yourself a little space underneath your your flaps, so that you can actually subtract these two numbers. I want to see that you follow each single step to get there and subtract them. So once you've gone through and subtracted them, we are going to be done with this little video. So we've looked at what the pieces of a fraction are, and we really looked at adding and subtracting. So in the next chunk is where we're going to be looking at multiplying and dividing. So make sure that you spend a little bit of time going through here, because this is kind of a little tough thing, but we're going to be doing this often and over again, so this does need to be something you really understand. So as always, when you get stuck or when you have questions, please come find me or shoot me a quick email.